Hello and welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to an episode of the OSINT Bunker podcast. Today is season 4, episode 4. I'm joined by my co-host OSINT Technical, and this evening we're also joined by our guest Coopshaw. I believe your name is Benjamin, is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Hello.
We'll probably be referring to you as Benjamin or Ben throughout the podcast, just so that we don't stumble over our words. There's been a lot going on, probably, I think it's fair to say, in the last 48 hours. Obviously, we've had a number of developments in Ukraine, Russia, which we will come to later on in the episode. But I think at the moment there's probably a fair amount of focus on China, on Taiwan, and on the imminent visit by US diplomatic officials of various sorts.
Editor Technical here, just to say that I may have waited a week to edit this. So I was on vacation. This is all going to be slightly outdated. I'm going to be jumping in to add little fixes and, my own comments, but just I'll be back.
To Taiwan. I believe at the time of recording, the aircraft carrying them is currently on the ground in Hawaii, and will shortly be getting airborne.
Editor Technical back here really quickly, just to say that the trip went, as relatively well as it could. The Chinese are sort of freaking out right now with several tests scheduled, rocket firings. They've crossed the median line on the Taiwan Strait a couple of times and did simulated attacks against Taiwanese high-value targets. But the trip itself, they did not shoot down Pelosi's plane. A lot of their bravado ended up being, standard Chinese bravado.
Again, for the final leg of the journey to Taiwan. I think we'll just briefly cover that topic, if that's all right with you guys. China has.
Yeah, I would formally.
Oh, go on.
I would just like to start by saying, I'm formally sorry for taking a vacation. Obviously, at this point, it's clear that I've caused this entire problem by deciding to just be offline.
Yeah, for those wondering, Technical is doing his usual mad sort of maneuver, and he is currently joining us in this recording, I believe from the middle of the desert in Arizona on this occasion. For those not aware, Technical has a habit with this podcast of being in some very, very unusual locations, not just in the US, but actually around the world when recording episodes. I don't know which locations I'm allowed to even discuss that you've sort of popped up in before. I think you've been in Eastern Europe a couple of times, Middle East on maybe
Eastern, Western Europe,
all over the US.
Yeah, just
I think at the minute you're sat in a park.
yeah, okay. In my defense, this is the first actual vacation where I haven't done work in like the past 2 years. So I am using that as my defense.
But yeah, as I was saying, China has taken a very, very vocal stance about this US visit to Taiwan. Obviously, China over the years has been very, very vocal about Taiwan anyway. We won't go into the long and complicated history that is China-Taiwan relations. But it's...
I love that. I love that incredibly diplomatic tone you use by saying vocal.
Yeah, it's one of those things where this has been an ongoing issue for a very, very long time, and China has once again sort of perked up and been very, very vocal, very verbally aggressive. We've seen sort of the Chinese government's mouthpiece in the international media, the Global Times, has been very, very vocal in the last few days. I've seen tweets by various members of the Global Times saying things to the effect of, "Oh, we'll shoot down any American aircraft entering Taiwan's airspace. It'll mean war if US diplomats go to Taiwan, and things like that, which, needless to say, in the current state that the world is in, are not exactly helpful comments to be making. Not that China cares particularly about whether or not its comments are helpful.
I mean, it is interesting to, see China looking at the situation that Russia's currently in Ukraine and saying, huh, yeah, I want that right now. It is, I mean, of all the times where they could be very intensely posturing, this is just an odd one, frankly, just due to the current, geopolitical situation. It's not exactly a time where I personally, though I don't control a country, would exactly be making these kinds of threats. Because, I mean, China would have to look at the situation in Russia and go, well, it's fairly obvious that we would need to prepare for an operation like this for much longer and, amass the necessary resources to do something like this. Because, China, or the Republic of China, Taiwan, certainly has a more capable military than Ukraine, at least at the moment, and Ukraine has gotten some assets recently, which has definitely made the comparison more interesting. And, China has to make an amphibious crossing across the Strait of Taiwan to actually to make a landing and then fight through a mixture of heavily urban and a very mountainous terrain in order to take the country. And they have amassed a significant quantity of standoff weapons, like their ballistic missiles and their various types of cruise missiles, land, bomber launched, all those assets. But I mean, at the same time, Taiwan has also spent the last 50, 60 years preparing for an operation like that as well. And I mean, historically, the relationship has been a bit more adversarial, one would say. During the 1950s, 1960s, there were, active incidents where both sides attempted to shoot each other's planes down over the strait. And that was certainly, I would say, definitely more contentious than it was right now. But I don't, and this is obviously and I will always say this, unprofessional view. I really don't think China is in a position at the moment where they could start something and actually win it. They might be able to start something and control the situation because, again, there's that water border. Taiwan will never be able to invade China in the way that China would have the capability to invade Taiwan. So they may be able to control the situation if they start something, but I don't necessarily see an end game here where they come out as a victor if things escalate. And obviously we've seen discussions between Biden and Xi. The situation is complex. China, doesn't necessarily have the capability at the moment to, fully invade Taiwan.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of discussed that in previous episodes as well, the fact that as much as China goes on about its long-term intentions to sort of make Taiwan a part of mainland China, we've kind of touched on the fact that even with China's enormous military build-up and the sheer rate at which they are building warships and tanks and aircraft, to all intents and purposes, they are probably still quite a few years away from being in a position where they're actually ready to turn around and say, right, okay, let's launch this operation. I think ultimately as well, as we've alluded to before, they're going to be looking at what's happened to Russia with this invasion of Ukraine, and they'll probably be looking at that and thinking, okay, let's not rush this, let's make sure that we are ready before we take those steps. And Taiwan's well aware of this, and they are undeniably concerned, and rightfully so, And so these visits by US diplomats and indeed other diplomats are no doubt part of a long-term plan by Taiwan and allies to sort of enable a better defence when the time comes. Obviously, that's a discussion we could potentially have in another episode as to what such a response would be to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, whether there would be the kind of response we've seen in terms of military equipment and so on being supplied as has been the case with Ukraine, or whether in those circumstances potentially forces in that part of the world might other forces might get involved in the situation, whether that be the likes of the US and Australia and Korea and Japan and so on.
Yeah, I think China has to answer in some way to Pelosi coming to Taiwan. I think we're seeing a bit of that now with threats to her airplane and stuff like that. But I'm not sure how far they want to go if and when she arrives on the island. And what I find interesting, I don't know if you guys saw, but there are videos now being published on Twitter and stuff like that, showing what is said to be videos of trains going into provinces next to Taiwan. And I think that's not a coincidence. If we're seeing videos, we never see videos like that, and we're seeing them now, is because they want to scare people into thinking that they are ready to use the military to respond to the Pelosi arriving on the island. But I really don't think it's going to go that far. But there probably will be a certain response. Like, I was thinking maybe like fighter jets crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait or something like that. I guess that would be a certain...
I'm positive we'll see harassment across into the Taiwanese ADIZ, which is the Air Defense Identification Zone. Not Taiwanese airspace. It's the area where Taiwan will get all worked up about Chinese aircraft being there, while Chinese aircraft will stay within the bounds of international law. I'm absolutely sure we'll see that, and I will genuinely be surprised if we don't. But yeah, I definitely think that may be a characteristic to this.
And we've already seen footage today, haven't we, of sort of military exercises by China, which were announced less than 24 hours ago, it should be noted. And we've seen sort of gunfire and flares being launched over the Taiwan Strait by the Chinese. There was one particular video that was being shared on Twitter earlier that was quite startling, with just the sheer amount of flares being dropped over the water, machine gun fire out over the sea, and even just regular Chinese citizens on sort of a coastal road, all getting out of their cars and filming this spectacle going on sort of in the middle of the night.
It's meant to be. I guess it's meant to be impressive and make people. I mean, it could be us. I mean, people watching, U.S. citizens, Taiwanese people, make them scared and impressed by. I mean, making things tense and stuff like that. So again, I don't really know how they want to respond when she lands, but.
Yeah, so I think the next 24 hours would be interesting, because that's obviously sort of the time frame we're looking at for her arriving in Taiwan.
Yeah, people were saying like a blockade or something like that, but I think that's too big and could actually hurt China. So I don't see a blockade being a good solution for China.
And obviously, we need to remember as well that obviously a blockade is a declaration of war in terms of international law. Obviously, famous Americans just blockade of Cuba in '62 as a quarantine. Now, whether China would be quite so diplomatic with it,
I mean, yes, there is an aspect of it was a quarantine per se because ships were allowed through. If China were to try to enforce a blockade, though, it would be basically the equivalent of the U.S. or NATO trying to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Um, it, you know, China would actually have to again enforce that blockade, and Taiwan isn't a non-player in this scenario. They have the assets to attack Chinese surface assets.
Yeah, and again, I don't see China risking something like that. If it fails or something like that, it'd be very bad for them. They need to try something they can really control. I think that's the most important thing. Is they need to control the situation. They can't again try a blockade and not manage or something like that would be terrible for them.
Yeah. And they know at the moment there would be far too many variables for them to control the situation, as you say. So it's not something that they are necessarily looking to do. They'll, be plenty vocal about it. They, as you say, they will probably fly aircraft across the strait into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and they'll probably, make sure that they're visible and that they make a massive deal out of it. But ultimately, these comments by, for example, the Global Times saying, "Oh, we'll shoot down Nancy Pelosi," it's not going to happen. If something like that were to happen, then I think it's fair to say Ukraine and Russia would not be a topic of major interest to us for much longer, because the consequences of such an action out there in China and Taiwan would be far wider reaching than the war in Ukraine, which in and of itself is quite wide reaching.
Yeah, and I think it would be irresponsible for us not to talk about, the impact of wolf warrior diplomacy and the specific language that comes from places like the Global Times, where they put out these incredibly inflammatory statements that seem aimed at a domestic nationalist audience in China, but really alienate them from a global market. It really scares people in those both unaligned and other Western pro-U.S. countries. That language, those very threatening statements that come from various Global Times contributors and the Global Times itself. That diplomacy certainly hurts China's soft power and their ability to project. And I think we'll continue to see that happen into the future, where it really has hurt those initiatives like the Belt and Road and other, those projections of China's soft power. And I think I'll probably say soft power 50 more times in this episode, because it's truly what China was supposed to be doing. If you look 2008 Olympics, was this big presentation. I mean, China's actions to clean up Beijing, to make Beijing look really good for the Olympics for everyone, was super important for them. And they took a lot of, time to perform that. And that was a huge exercise of soft power. And then they go and ruin it by having, state-backed, what are effectively propaganda outlets like the Global Times make these statements. And it's just this massive amount of wasted effort.
Global Times doesn't always reflect what the Communist Party does. I think there are another level in nationalists, and I mean it's not exactly the same. You don't really see the perfect reflection of actions taken by the party in what the Global Times says. It's always more threats and stuff like that than what is actually done by the party. I mean, maybe wrong, but that's how I see the Global Times, especially the main editor.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly, but I still think there's an element of people thinking that the Global Times, because again, they have that seal of approval from the party itself. There's the idea that the Global Times may be presenting a view that is not necessarily prevalent in the party, but present. And a view that has an impact in the party's positions.
It probably does have an impact. I think they probably do influence or try to influence what the party does, but it's not always work, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's always something to remember. And as we saw in the conversation between Xi and Biden, um, there is an impact on that. I mean, if you look, I know some people had mentioned the fact that both sides didn't mention there was unilateral or bilateral progress made in either of the readouts released. There was definitely a definitive statement that they had talked, but no real directionality in those talks. And there is that concern that those possibly global times only or extreme side of the party only opinions have percolated up and perhaps now reflect something that may be becoming prevalent in the party. And at this point, who knows? I mean, in China right now, Xi is the party. He has a lot of unilateral control, and a lot of what he has done has been, Xi's own both opinions, motives, and modus operandi. It's his theories on how China should be and how things should be, and I think we'll continue to see that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of sort of nations making sort of very vocal and not necessarily all that diplomatic comments, I think it probably is a good point for us to lead into sort of developments in Russia and Ukraine in sort of particularly, I suppose, the last 72 hours, 96 hours. There's obviously been allegations of some pretty horrific war crimes, particularly in the last sort of 72 hours. And we've also seen...
Yeah, which of the several incidents do you want to talk about?
Well,
it's just
I'm wary that we obviously need to be careful what details we discuss on the platform, just because of the nature of some of these things that have gone on. But I was kind of going to start by sort of discussing the sort of public statements that have been made by, for example, the Russian embassy in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you two saw that tweet from the Russian embassy in the UK earlier today, which has caused an almighty stir on social media.
Yes, Twitter elected not to remove the tweet, but has flagged it.
Yeah.
As promoting violence. And sorry, this is a country's embassy who has been flagged by Twitter for promoting violence.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, look, the tweet was, and let me pull up the tweet so I have the very specific language.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm just pulling up the tweet
It
now.
was, yeah, it was, and let me quote it directly here. Hashtag Azov militants deserve execution, comma, but death not by firing squad, but by hanging, comma, because they're not real soldiers, period. They deserve a humiliating death, period. A married couple from Mariupol tell how they were shelled by Ukrainian forces from hashtag Azovstal, period, hashtag stop Nazi Ukraine. And then they quoted a video where they were quoting people saying residents of Mariupol, the Azov militants, deserve execution. And this was produced, and it looks like it was both produced and released by Russian state sources. And then, of course, both quoted and endorsed by the Russian embassy in the UK. So it's very. I don't think there's much ambiguity in what they're saying there.
Yeah. But just
I mean, directly endorsing war crimes.
Yeah, just to be absolutely clear, what they are calling for there in that tweet is the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Now, for those of you not perhaps so familiar with the rules of war, otherwise known as the Geneva Convention, executing prisoners of war is one of the big no-nos of the Geneva Convention. it's with the use of chemical weapons, for example, which, of course, Russia has a track record of, needless to say, with Salisbury not that many years ago now, and various other locations.
Yeah. But it's not just executing them, but purposely saying they want to execute them in a humiliating manner, which is there are legitimately layers of war crime like in this statement. It's absolutely shocking. And as I said in a tweet, it reveals really of where these motivations come from. Obviously, this was okayed at the Russian state level. And indicates that a lot of these crimes that they're committing are premeditated and endorsed by the state. This really, it's hard to draw this difference between Russia, the state, committing the crimes, and maybe individual units or individual soldiers committing the crimes. There really is the confirmation here that these crimes are being committed at the state level, if not directly commanded, then implicitly endorsed. And I know, people try to draw the community, oh, America did XYZ war crime. Well, most of the people who did those war crimes are in prison, or or some level of accountability was had. Obviously, there are plenty of cases where the proper amount of accountability was not had. Proper channel or proper consequences were not, dealt out. But there was at least a clear sense that the state did not endorse these crimes, whereas what's happening in Ukraine right now is a pretty clear indication of support at the state level. And there are very few countries that have done that.
I must say, I never saw something similar. It's the first time I see a government like publicly saying something like that. I find it pretty shocking. And I think
I legitimately, yeah.
And this brings us, I think, to what happened in this prison in occupied Donetsk, I guess, where they claim Ukrainians shelled the prison and killed 50 of the 50 Ukrainian prisoners. I mean, you can't say something like that. I mean, hours before your embassy publishes a tweet like that. I mean, that's my own opinion, of course, but I mean, yeah.
I mean, it's again, their motivations are pretty clear. Like, I don't, anyone at this point who attempts to argue in bad faith about war crimes like this, I mean, should not be taken seriously. I don't think you can draw any equivalence between perceived or real crimes committed by the Ukrainians with what the Russians are doing at this point. I genuinely believe that anyone who engages in that whataboutism isn't they're not engaging in good faith. There is no attempt at a debate there. It's impossible. I think that's what we have to say on the matter. I mean, it's just I think I can speak for all of us when we say that we're genuinely shocked.
Yeah. I think we've seen over the course of this conflict, and obviously where, this podcast has covered a number of conflicts over the last sort of 2 years, we've seen a lot of pretty horrific scenes. We've heard a lot of horrific stories. You do get to a point where a lot of these things don't really have much of an effect on you. You kind of become hard to them. But I think the stories that we've sort of seen coming out of Russia and Ukraine, particularly the last 24, 48 hours, they have sort of, knocked us a bit. They have left us quite shocked, quite disgusted. And as you say, we're talking serious war crimes here. I know pretty much day one of the war, the international community began setting up the War Crimes Convention for, in preparation for the events that would unfold. And I certainly do not envy the people working on that team right now who are having to inevitably pour through all this new footage, all this new information that's coming through. of all these atrocities that are being committed. It's it's horrific enough as it is to be hearing about it. It's no doubt far worse to have to be investigating it. And unfortunately, as one journalist has put it, the mask, if there ever really was a mask on the Russian government's face, is well and truly off now. That there is no doubt as to what their intentions are. There is no doubt as to the full evil of the regime and its intent against the Ukrainian people. And I fear we are going to see examples of these atrocities become more and more frequent in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah. At the same time, they still publish videos showing that Ukrainians and Russians are brothers and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, very odd. I mean, I'm not surprised in one way, sadly.
Yeah. And I think as well, while we're just discussing Ukraine and Russia, we had the interesting situation. I think it was it yesterday or day before yesterday? Russian Telegram channels began circulating a map. Now, I will, full disclosure here and now, we do not know how accurate this map is. It may very well just be some sort of, fantasy dreamed up by a very pro-Russia group. But this map was entitled "The Decolonisation of Europe." For those of you who follow me on Twitter, you will have seen I did tweet the English translation version of that map, along with sort of a bit of a joke comment about it. The fact that it envisions Russia taking over the whole of Europe and decolonising it from its current sort of nation-state layout. The sort of notable examples being that Portugal becomes an offshoot of Brazil. The United Kingdom is split into 6 or 7 chunks, including an Emirate of London. And as much as I do sort of just, I take it with a bucket of salt and assume it is just a bit of a joke. Russia has been very, very clear in very public comments over the last few months that yes, this special military operation is going on in Ukraine, but it's not necessarily just planning to restrict itself to Ukraine. I know we've sort of had concerns about I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so I apologise in advance, but the Transnistria region of, I believe it's Moldova. That has been sort of an area of Europe that has been very much in Russian sights. Whether or not that extends further, I know Russia has made threats towards several Eastern European countries in the last few months. I know that today Russia has cut off the gas supply to Latvia as part of its ongoing sort of proxy war against NATO. I do, as I say, I take this map with a bucket of salt, but far be it from me to say that it's impossible, especially in light of everything we've seen, in Ukraine in the last sort of 5-6 months, and indeed in the wider world in the last year and a half. We were sat here, probably this time last year, looking at Afghanistan and thinking, yeah, something might happen. And then, of course, a month later, it all kicked off. So far be it from me to say that Russia is not capable of, trying at the very least to enact the decolonisation of Europe as described by this map. But I certainly I can't see it happening with the current state of the Russian military, which, I think at this point they are rapidly approaching 100,000 casualties or some ridiculously high number of that sort.
Yeah, there was a U.S. congressional briefing apparently where the U.S. intelligence community said Russia had sustained about 75,000 casualties in Ukraine so far. And based on reporting now from the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainians have brought down their daily casualty figures either to be either in line with the Russians' casualty figures day by day, or lower than it, which is definitely interesting to see. If the Ukrainians are attriting at a lower rate than the current Russian. I think there are various words you could use to describe it, but I'll just say bad experience in Ukraine.
And they're also losing. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw it, but I published a satellite image of a Soviet storage site being. I mean, vehicles are being brought out of storage in Siberia. And I think this is another sign that Russia is doing very poorly in Ukraine currently. I mean, they're losing equipment, people, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically confirmed at this point that pretty much every frontline Russian unit outside severe losses in Ukraine, or has had a troop stolen to go to Ukraine.
And we're seeing it now in like the eastern part of Ukraine. They're using like Chechen fighters and stuff. It seems like there's like more of volunteer units than actual Russian soldiers fighting currently. And again, that's another sign that things are not going perfectly as planned.
Yeah, and ultimately that comes down to the fact that they've had, as Technical says, the sort of 75,000 plus casualties. Russia has lost a substantial part of its professionally trained military at this stage. I think at this stage maybe we'll just briefly talk about Iraq. And it is kind of difficult actually, because I was hoping that Technical would be sort of able to help me out with this.
Oh man, Editor Technical here to say that the situation is complex. That's what I would have said during the episode. For lack of a better term, and I know that's kind of my catchphrase because I don't like, getting myself into a corner. Sadir and his followers kind of come from the school of protesting as a way to create change. And I know I probably should consult other people before I make these definitive statements, but again, Sadir is the anti-Iranian sort of candidate. The Iranians have a lot of armed control of Iraq right now, and his supporters see this protest as really the only solid option to, move forward.
Iraq has obviously been a topic we've discussed a number of times on the podcast over the last sort of 18 months. It's a very, very volatile region of the world. It features very, very keenly in the news, for us at least, on various occasions. The last sort of week, I haven't really noticed an awful lot going on in Iraq, and then all of a sudden this morning, I was getting pinged left, right, and centre with people saying, "Oh,
Editor Technical back again." It's like 1 in the freaking morning here, so I'm trying to go quickly. But in effect, this is a continuation of the 2021 elections that is basically deepened into this political crisis. Sadir pretty much won in 2021. He sort of was able to coalesce this amount of control. Earlier this year, there was sort of this chaotic parliamentary session. The senior interim parliament speaker, Mashadani, fell ill and actually ended up going to the hospital, and it was honestly this massive chaotic just series of events that basically resulted in no one having actual control. But technically Sadr had like the mandate of the people, so he was able and still is able to sort of run around and say that he's the current leader even though he isn't. So in effect, no government's really been formed. There is really no real center of power right now, and it's turning into this a big struggle between the Iranian-backed parties and the Sadrists. But what happened in June was that basically all his members who had won, 73 of them, actually stepped down to protest what was happening. Now, they were actually replaced with pro-Iranian members of parliament, which has turned or given the Iranian factions this, or pro-Iranian factions this advantage, this lead, where they're actually looking like they're going to be able to put together a ruling coalition with enough seats. Now, the problem with that is, of course, Sadr's supporters believe that, he won the largest portion of the election. He should be in charge of the government. And it's sort of getting into this deepening political crisis where his supporters, they believe they have the mandate. So they broke into the green zone. They're camping out in the parliament right now. And that's currently where we are. Sadr actually went out a few days ago. This is from me talking on the 7th of August and actually called for new snap elections. But I don't think that's highly likely, as the Iranian factions look like they have a chance to actually secure power or secure an actual government.
Are you seeing what's going on in Iraq? I'm no expert, so I won't go into too much detail, but from what I've been told, a significant protest took place today in Baghdad. This protest group made their way to the Green Zone, which obviously the Green Zone is famous for being home to a large portion of the foreign embassies to Iraq. It's notable obviously for being where the US Embassy is, which throughout last year we were regularly seeing rocket attacks against the Green Zone aimed at the US Embassy. Today, from what I can tell, this protest group have made their way to the Green Zone. They have managed to overwhelm the Iraqi riot police stationed around the outside of the Green Zone. They've ended up managing to break through from several directions the sort of outer wall of the Green Zone, and have made their way in. And last I heard, we were talking in excess of 50 casualties across both protesters and the local security forces. Live ammunition had apparently been fired, and there had been exchanges of fire between the two sides. But as of this evening, I think things had relatively calmed down to the point where protesters were apparently inside the Iraqi parliament building cooking themselves dinner. I don't know if Technical's in a position to sort of discuss more than that.
See your earlier statement.
I shall take that as a no.
Yep.
Yeah, so obviously Iraq might well be a location to keep an eye on in the coming days. We don't really know what on earth is really going on there. It's as I say, as usual, it is a little bit of a mess out there at the minute.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate.
I'm sure we will have a guest on next episode who will hopefully be able to give us a much more, detailed roundup of Iraq. I know Ben's sort of area of expertise is about as far from Iraq as you can get.
Exactly.
Sort of same with me, really. It's not an area of the world I'm overly focused on these days, but yeah, it would be an area to keep an eye on, and obviously with everything else that's been going on in China, Taiwan, and Ukraine, Russia, the world is showing once again that we are very much returning to sort of a pre-pandemic normal of volatility.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It feels like 2019, something like that. You know, when stuff were heating up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We obviously, I wasn't on last episode, but obviously we had this major incident in Japan the other week where former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated as well. And obviously that was something I believe we had back in 2019. We had the assassination of Iran's General Soleimani, which kind of sparked off a whole year of just utter madness in the Middle East and so on. Things obviously in Japan haven't really sort of kicked off as such, but no doubt that incident is also having an effect on sort of the wider Asian sort of diplomatic situation as well. But yeah, I don't really think there's an awful lot more we can talk about this week.
Yeah, I think
We shall go into a quick roundup of the news. So there's not an awful lot of sort of news stories we're going to cover this week, but just a few brief mentions. The Royal Navy has officially welcomed into service an experimental vessel with hull number X01. The vessel is of, I believe it's Dutch build, and is intended to be used as an experimental vessel for various sort of tests and self-driving technologies, so to speak, for ships. The Royal Navy have been making quite a lot of fanfare about this new vessel, which arrived in Plymouth earlier this week. So it will be interesting in the next few weeks and months to see what they actually do with that ship. A number of fast jet types across the world have faced grounding this week. Towards the start of this week, we had a story that broke in the UK regarding both the Eurofighter Typhoon and the BAE Systems Hawk jets, where both types were grounded temporarily due to a technical issue with the ejector seats. No further details were really provided at the time, and the Hawk jets were very quickly allowed to fly again, with the Typhoons following suit a few days later. It was notable that the German Air Force also grounded their Typhoons around about the same time, again citing an ejector seat issue. As I understand it now, the United States has also now sort of flagged an issue with ejector seats in several types of their jets. I believe the Hornet, Super Hornet, F-35 and a couple of other types are among the models that have been sort of either grounded or partially grounded due to these issues. We do, thanks to the Americans, have a little bit more information now about the issue. All of the types of aircraft involved in these groundings apparently use various models of Martin Baker ejection seats. Martin Baker obviously being a world leader in the production and maintenance of military ejector seats. As I understand it, there was some remark about the American problem that was identified, something to do with a cartridge in the ejection seats that was identified as the issue. A significant number of the F-35s operated by the United States military have been grounded as a result of this. I'm told that it's also affecting aircraft including the F-18s, as I've already mentioned, T-45 Goshawks, which are obviously the American version of the BAE Hawk jet trainer, and it's not at this moment in time known how long the problem will persist for, but obviously that is a fairly major issue, that it's wiping out a significant portion of American fast jet fleets with this issue. And to round it up, Brazil has taken delivery of their first Airbus A330 multi-role tanker transport. Brazil is one of several countries now worldwide operating the Type, and we know that there are a number of additional airframes due for delivery in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. While we're on the topic of South America, Chile has also taken receipt of former UK RAF E-3 Wedgetail aircraft. The RAF sold the airframes to Chile not too long ago, and Chile seems intent on putting these airframes into operational service. So those aircraft touched down in Chile earlier this week. And I think that's probably going to be it for us. So, Ben, it's been a pleasure having you on, mate.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
I do apologise to all our listeners on behalf of Technical and his various technical issues. Hopefully I will be able to convince him to actually record an episode from a sort of a sensible location next time round.
I am pleased to announce that I will be hosting the next episode from Antarctica.
So that we don't have him rubber banding quite so much. But he's stubborn, so we'll see what happens. Don't forget that you can listen to the podcast on both YouTube and Spotify. We're aware that those are sort of the main two platforms you guys are listening to us on. But you can also download the episode for free from the RSS website, link to which we will post on our Twitter and various other social media links. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. This has been the OSINT Bunker podcast, Season 4, Episode 4, and we will hopefully catch you all again in 2 weeks' time.